Zipho Sikhakhane is a sought-after global speaker, thought leader, writer, and business strategist. She also serves on several boards and has a Master of Business Administration from Stanford University in the United States. A lifetime entrepreneur and angel investor, she also founded EMZ Advisory, a management consulting firm operating since 2015, enabling leaders and businesses to unleash their growth potential. In this podcast, she shares about her journey to self discovery and accelerated growth in life, career, and business on a more intimate setting, a podcast.
Welcome to Mastery Sessions with Zipho.
So, in getting started with the building blocks of optimism, right? I mean, there's certain things, right, and certain elements of it that some people are lucky, right? You get the genetic lottery. And for some individuals, right, sometimes it's up to about 30% that can actually contribute to their ability or their likelihood to actually be optimistic. Children of optimists tend to be more optimistic themselves. I mean, environment is a big contributor. But I mean, if you didn't get that lottery, it doesn't mean, right, that it's the end of the world for you, right? So, there's also the other side, right? Where optimism is actually something that you can learn, and the earlier you start, the better. And I don't do well with excuses, right? So unless you've reached 100, which is apparently how long would leave now, you still have time to get started. Now, there's things that can get in your way, right? I mean, for example, if you grew up in a socioeconomic environment that is not really encouraging of optimism, I know I come, from such. It does affect you, right? It definitely, and also even just thinking, right? If you've gone from a thinking perspective, if you've gone through certain experiences like trauma, like stress, it can really be hard, right, to get into that space of learning different ways of being optimistic, right? And so let me get started with some of the ones that are more easier from a day-to-day perspective, just to get going. So there's something called comparative optimism, right? So there's people who believe that they are more likely than others to go through positive events. The examples always of, let's call it parking at a shopping mall, and being those individuals who just always believe, they'll get that space. I promise I'm one of them. And I always go to the front, and most of the time you get the space, but it's because you went there, right? I mean, it's really as simple as that. If it's not there, it's fine. Remember what I said about failure before? You can just look elsewhere. Remember what I said before when you're talking about, relooking at failure in the moment that it happens, right? You just move on. If you don't get the parking spot, you don't get the parking spot. You don't go, you see, I always never get the space. It's simple things like that. There's also a more philosophical based way of being an optimist, right? So there's those people who are like, the present moment is the best, of all possible outcomes, and they really stay with it, right? And find a way to leverage that as a means to get their optimism. And they always believe that, you know what, this is the best of the circumstances that could have happened at this given time. Look, there could be many other ways, right, in which you could define and really lean on being an optimist. I think what's important is to discover and really figure out the way that works well for you as a person and as an individual, right? So that you're able to figure out what it is that you can identify with, what it is that you can identify with as a person, so that you can leverage that identity to encourage you to start the path towards what we call learned optimism. Now, I'll be honest with you, right? So when you're trying to learn optimism because maybe you didn't get the genetic lottery, or maybe your environment or your circumstances were not really very much enabling, right? It could be many things, but I'll be honest, it's not as simple as just focusing on the positive, right? I mean, I could have just started with that and we end the conversation here. It's typically about developing that more optimistic perspective, right? Which basically involves recognizing things as they happen, right? And then looking at ways to then think, right, about how do I actually leverage this to support my growth and leverage this to actually support my resilience, right? I mean, there's a whole school of this when you're thinking about the concepts of positive psychology. And there's many proponents that are experts on this that you can study, right? But one of the things that's important to note is that if in any way it doesn't come naturally to you, right? you need to be prepared to make the effort, right? I mean, nothing comes easy in life, right? I mean, some people do things like just simple as affirmations, right? Especially if you're in a space where it's really hard to do those on a daily basis. I mean, look at the mirror, I mean, put the sticker, right? Put it around you on your laptop, on your iPad. I mean, every single day when I'm going through a period where I'm struggling to be optimistic, I take stick notes, write on them, I put on my laptop so that I see it, right in front of me. And it's the first thing I see, it's the first thing that I interact with as often as possible until I can shift my mind space to where I would like it to be. And these are simple things, right? Think of the things that you come across or interact with in your home, even in your business environment more regularly, and figure out how you can put some of those things. And there's a lot of good books on this. I'm happy to share at a later stage. And also realizing that, to find that different perspective, right? And there's many places that you can go to. I mean, especially if you're still struggling further to find ways to just harness it, within you as an individual. So I'll share an example. When part of my career, I spent a period, coaching different sort of leaders in business, right? Sort of management teams, in groups, individuals. Now I'm at a point where I've developed a whole team, right, of coaches, different areas of expertise, but central to that, they're all just focusing on how do we use these different tools. So there's many things that you can leverage, but what I've seen and what I've found, right, is that maybe if you believe, it could really help you to get other people involved and on the journey. Let me use coaching as an example. So I used to coach many, groups of management teams, or even at an individual level, just executives in the business context. Now I've transitioned, so I have a whole team of coaches that are running, and working with different clients, right? And one of the things that I always used to say is that, when you're being holistic, right, and you're developing yourself on your leadership journey, is that there's this need to learn to wear different hats. So some hats might be harder to wear, some hats might be easier for you to wear. It's not about being an expert at all the different hats. I mean, it's about learning how do I use a very, very specific hat, even if it's hard for me, so that I can leverage that hat when I need it, right? Because sometimes, you need to show up and maybe it's not even your best day, but you need to be sharing a message that's getting people to deliver something, because maybe that's the most important day. Maybe there's a big product launch. In that moment, you put on that hat, you get onto that toolkit, and then you leverage and you lead and operate from that space. Now, the thing that's difficult, right, is our brains. Now, let's talk about the wiring of our brains, because the thing is, in our brains, we're naturally wired, right, to be very much receptive to risk, right? It goes back to that natural freeze, fight, fright response. Let's talk about our brains, right? Because ultimately, they're actually naturally designed, right? They're wired in such a way that they're actually highly receptive in many ways to taking on, different risks. So we have what we call, I'm sure many people are familiar, that freeze, flight, or fight response, right? It's actually not about whether you have it or not. It's actually more about identifying which is the one that comes the easiest to you. And there's a whole history, anthropologically, that where all of this comes from, right? And if you look at our ancestors, right, they always were on the lookout for predators, right? You had these the chances of you being killed, right, by an animal, right? It was a reality. So every day your brain is like, I'm running from a lion. It's always looking for what's wrong, where is the risk, right? I mean, it's just a natural wiring. I mean, we're not very far from having lived like that as a civilization, right? And so we're always looking out for risks, and we're always looking at what could go wrong, what could break, etc., and how do I become responsive, right? But the key thing is that the context in which we live now, as much as it's different, 90% of our brain, right, is still very much from that, primitive states that it comes from. And there's actually a portion of the brain. It's called the amygdala, right? And it really screens everything for negativity. Like it's like a lens, right? Even in the best moments, it's like, but what is negative here? What could be going wrong here? Actually, one of my favorite researchers and authors is a lady called Brene Brown, right? And she came up with this concept called foreboding joy. And she talks about how in our happiest and also most joyful moments in life, the first thing that happens, we immediately go to worry, right? And, something as simple as, you're very excited for maybe your child to go on this trip. immediately as the bus leaves, you say, oh my gosh, what happens if there's an accident, right? Even though it was a moment of joy because everyone, has been looking forward to that incident. She actually says joy is one of the most vulnerable of human emotions. And instead of learning to tolerate joy, we immediately go into what she calls it's a dress rehearsal for tragedy, right? And what this does to us is that we then end up hesitating to actually celebrate the small victories that are due in the moment, right? And ultimately, then our brain, right, in these moments, it has this alarm system, right, that's there to show, okay, fine, how do I survive? So when it identifies the risks, right, when it thinks of different things that are happening, we get triggered, right? We really get triggered, even in our most optimistic and most positive moments. And we become overly sensitive, right? And especially more so when you a victim in any way from a PTSD perspective, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Which, to be honest, having grown up in South Africa and the history we have in this country, I think we're all victims of this, and maybe the whole world, right? With everything that we've gone through these couple of years. So what then ends up happening is that if you go into that stage, right, it's really hard for your brain to actually separate what is safe and what is not. All of a sudden everything looks dangerous, right? Your amygdala has now triggered your natural alarm system, and then when you're trying to continue or just operating in that moment, your body is already in a fear response, right? And for me, naturally, I know I struggle a lot because I go to sort of the freeze, fight, flight. I freeze, right? That's my immediate. I freeze, right? So I'm definitely not going to be the one who's going to be fighting with you or running away. But I freeze, right? But if I don't do that conscious effort, right, of learning, right, how to actually get myself out of that freeze state, it builds up in the body. I get very tense, knots on my back, and then having to do all this work to then find a way to tell my alarm system over and over and over, there is no lion, right? There is no fire. The world is not ending. This is actually just a daily stressor, but it's about how the body actually responds. So I think it's more about realizing, actually more accepting ourselves and how we are wired, that it's always about survival. It gets overstimulated at certain points, and we actually lose our rationality altogether. I mean, so what's called the prefrontal cortex, it actually just it goes in a bit of a retirement. It just disappears, and all of a sudden that part of the brain that you're using for logic, rational decision making, that's not the moment it operates, right? It's as if you've hit a break, and everything is about, okay, so how do I get out from the state? So it's important to be able to identify this as it happens. Now, as you spend more tools, like really learning, right, and understanding how you can be a more optimistic individual, one of the things that's happened to me personally is that the more I learn, right, the more I learn about, okay, so what are the different things that trigger me? What are the things that get me into that free state? My actual recovery time reduces, right? So before, maybe it would be weeks, we're at a point where it's like not even a day, it's maybe even goes down to seconds, right? Depending on the incident. So it's about identifying when these moments happen to you, when you get to a point where, okay, my amygdala is overstimulated. Oh, look, rational logic gone. Okay, look at me behaving, reacting in a certain way. And then what is it possible so that I can get to the other side? To use an everyday example, right? I mean, it's like it's like basically like imagine a car, right? You're used to accelerating at a certain pace. You need the brake. You realize the brake is not working, right? That's basically what happens when your prefrontal cortex goes through that struggle. So it's normal. It's not anything to be worried about, but it's important to realize which of the responses actually come naturally to you, and being able to have the self-awareness to master yourself in that moment. Now, there's this thing called negativity bias, okay? And because of everything that I just explained, right, it comes a lot easily to us, we then 10 times more likely, the average human to pay attention to negative news than positive news. Negative news is also sexier, right? It sells the papers, it brings in the viewership, and that's what makes the headlines. And to be honest, I actually haven't read any news in over 2.5 years, because every time I looked, it didn't make any sense to me why everything out there is so one-sided, right? And maybe there's pros and cons to that. The choice is yours. But, I mean, you switch on anything today, whether it's, on social media, on television or whatever. It's that any content that you see is sort of designed, right, to sort of overstimulate that primal brain that I was talking about, right? And if anything, imagine every second you're interacting with that kind of content, your brain is saying, keep me safe from the lion, right? Keep me safe from the lion. There's an attack that's coming, right? And this, it just goes on and on and on. And so what ends up happening is the world that we're in now, everything is dramatized, right? It's like, everything. It's like, how do I make this sound even more dramatic so that I can make sure that it gets their attention? And by default, the positive events then get far less attention, right? They get far less attention. And it's not that they don't exist, right? For every negative news I hear, and this is always a daily struggle with my family. Every time they're sharing any negative news, I come back and I say, I hear you, but isn't there also something great? And I know it's irritating, but I say this, isn't there something great that happened? Surely there must have been something great that also happened in the world in the day, to be able to sort of start working out of that negativity bias that we all have, right? So it's important to put in that effort, right? And really that intentionality, right? That we need so that we can start shifting our mindset, and getting to a point where it becomes more natural.